been a little bit of time since I did this. And this one was brought on by an actual Facebook comment I got. I made a post like I usually do about ADHD. And I think it was a funny reel that I did. Anyways, somebody popped in there and very nicely, very cordially just said, how do I feel about misdiagnosis rates? And he actually used the word cultural fad of people being diagnosed and kind of wanted to know my opinion on that. And, I've done some diving into it. I've looked at the graphs. And so this was my opportunity to do that. And so I found some really interesting reasons as to why do we see this sudden increase? Because we have a graph that started in 1997. And this graph is what everybody always refers to as why do we have such this growth rate of ADHD diagnosis? And it is from 1997 up until 2015 on this graph. It has significantly grown. The only thing we've heard about this is we know more about it. And that's the reason why more people are getting diagnosed, which surely I'm sure that is, but I don't think that sits well with most people. And it surely doesn't even sit well with me because we know that ADHD is genetic and we know that those genes that we are so blessed with, they're malleable. They can look different ways based on the support that somebody with ADHD gets through life, based on environmental factors. And we know there's like a lot of it. We hear about the pokes, the jabs that could be doing it, the pollution, the food, the dyes, you name it, everything's being. So the reason why when we hear we just know more about it. And that's the reason why people aren't so easy to swallow that pill, because we know of all these external things and we know how they affect neurology, and it's like nobody's talking about it. So it seems like a secret. It seems like people are hiding something maybe. And I think, that could be where a lot of this sort of disdain comes from about it. So I looked through the DSM. I rabbit holed about this. I took some notes that were really interesting to me that I kind of found throughout this timeline that, I'm not saying that this is the reason, but it makes a lot of sense. And when you would add the environmental factors into this, it lays another layer on top of it where you're like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. So let's start here. ADHD didn't just pop into existence suddenly in 1997 when this graph started. ADHD came into existence like 100 years ago. It's had tons of different names throughout that time. So that's number one. Like the early 1900s, we knew about ADHD. It just had a different name back then. So 1980, the DSM-3 came out with some new changes. And this is where we formally saw ADD, ADHD, however you know it, put into it was recognized. It was actually recognized as ADD, not ADHD at the time. So there was ADD at this time, and ADD was broken down into subcategories. So you have inattentive ADD and you had hyperactivity ADD. So you had two different types of ADD that could be looked at that time or could be diagnosed. And when you have two different versions of it, that opens up a lot of symptoms, right? Because you have these hyperactivity, ADD hyperactivity symptoms. And then you have this other category that's different, which is ADD inattentive symptoms. And so this is going to allow a lot bigger of a grouping of people, more symptoms. We can say more likely like, yes, this could be, you could have the inattentive, you could have hyperactivity ADD. So that happened. And you have to imagine, and I'm kind of foreshadowing this, that because we have two subtypes, we have a place for kids who looked more like me, who were bouncing off the walls, who talked a lot, who talked fast, who had to move a lot. And then you had a place for kids who didn't look like that, who were more quiet, did better in school, masked a lot more, but they were more spacey, which looked like two whole different things. But this gave room, again, to a lot of kids to be seen. So now let's fast forward to 1987. I was 4 years old and the DSM-3 goes through a change. It's still the DSM-3. They just kind of redid it. And during this time, specifically with ADD, they took the subtypes out. So now we don't have ADD hyperactivity and then ADD inattentive. We only have one, which is ADD hyperactive. So we just took these two groups of kids and pulled one of them out in 1987 and said, now only these kids qualify because they're hyperactive. And this did a few things. Hyperactivity was mostly seen in boys. And so in 87, in the late 80s, early 90s, this started going from a boy girl thing into really only pursued as a boy thing. Hyperactive. This is where we've seen it most. And so this was something that mostly only affected boys, which means for a very long time, women got missed out on. They are more of the inattentive type, typically, what we know now. And so we know that during this time, a lot of women weren't seen. A lot of girls in school, out of school, weren't seen. And so this really lowered that number during that time. But the problem is that this was in 1987. In 1987, we didn't have reliable ways to graph this. We weren't tracking this at all. I mean, we have numbers and we have studies from back then, but they're from local schools. Some of these were people were saying ADD, which is one subset of symptoms. Some others were calling it like a version of like a RSD or an ODD, which had a different set of symptoms. And so we do have kind of graphs from back then, but because everybody was using such different symptoms to diagnose or analyze, and it was school reported with a lot of these weren't like doctor reported. And so a lot of that information is skewed. In reality, inattentive kids didn't go away. What we saw more was just girls got missed, and that sucks. So 87, we go down to one subtype. We know that this is really starting to make it seem to be more of a something that affects little boys, not girls. Girls are being more missed. At this time, we bring the subtypes back in. We bring them back in 94. And in 94 is when the DSM-4 was introduced. But again, we weren't graphing, we weren't keeping track of any of this really until 97. So from 94 to 97, we don't have any data for when the changes made where we added another subtypes. All right, so in 1994 is when the DSM-4 came out. And with DSM-4 came the change from ADD to ADHD. We have ADHD inattentive subtype. We have ADHD hyperactivity subtype. And we have ADHD combined subtype. So we went from 2 subtypes, took it down to 1 subtype for, 6 years? And then added back 2 subtypes. So we went from being able to like diagnose like this many to this many to this many. And that happened because we knew more about ADHD. Suddenly we knew it was genetic. We knew what these symptoms looked like because we could see the genes, we could see the symptoms, we could see how they were attached. And so at this point, we knew, I guess I shouldn't say we knew, that sounds very conclusive. We were able to kind of put together like ADHD is a lot more than what we think it is. It is a big mishmash of different symptoms. But the key to this is that we added 2 more subtypes to this, and when you think about it, we have that inattentive and the hyperactive, right? Which is their own 2. But then that second one, it wasn't like its own set, right? This was like, if you have both, here's another one. Like it could have in some way bolstered those numbers. Like adding another subtype, a second subtype in from a first one is absolutely going to bolster those numbers. And I have to imagine that when this change was made in 94 to add ADHD and create these different subtypes, so that the day after that change, suddenly every doctor in the United States isn't suddenly going to be hip on it. And no, it's going to take time to change. We have to change, medical codes. We got to change insurance policies. We got to change. People have to know about it. People have to be taught about it. And then it has to be kind of put into action over time. And so from 94 to 97, when we see this bump, it kind of makes sense that we would suddenly see this. We might see a bump from, so I think in 97, it was like 5%, and then 98, 6%. Then it went up from there. And side note, if you take those original studies and just kind of see what people, they're not a great way to look at it, right? But we know a lot of these kids were probably ADHD, and it goes from like, before then it was, I think it was like 3 to 6%. And then from 3 to 6%, once we start tracking, it goes from like 5 to 6, and then it goes up from there. Now we're into like the 10%. But it kind of makes sense how we get there when we took away, right? We had 2, and many of kids were getting diagnosed, and then we took one away. And not only did we take one category away, which was a lot, but once we took that away, the culture there made it like it was very boys. It was girls had to be missed. And that went on for about 6 years until it got changed. And then about 3 years after that, we started actually gauging it. So once people started like, oh, this isn't a boy disease. Oh, I shouldn't say a boy disease. This isn't only affect little boys. This affects little boys and little girls. Oh, and during that time, we also realized it affects adults. It was believed that you grew out of this. ADHD was only for children. So only children were really being seen. And now once we get to that DSM-4 and that DSM-5, suddenly it went from being just boys to boys and girls to with the different subtypes to the 3 subtypes that can affect boys and girls that's also concentrating on adults because we know you don't grow out of it. Symptoms look different throughout life. And so once we kind of realize that, this affects more people, symptoms are a little bit wider than we thought. It affects boys and girls. It also affects adults because you don't grow out of it. Over time, that is going to open up that window of the percentage of people who are going to be diagnosed. When culture alone is saying this is probably only kids, then over the course of years, it says, actually, this is adults too. That's going to open that window to more diagnosis. Now, before, I go further on that portion, like I said at the beginning, there is this layer of environmental factors, right? We know that there's microplastics. We know that things like stress in the 3rd trimester, when a baby is still in utero, can cause genetic effects. And we know that food dyes, we know that certain foods, we know that chemicals that go in our grass, there's chemicals in the water. There's so many things that could contribute on top of that to make them go up. Absolutely. But from all the graphs that I've pulled, from the research that I'm seeing throughout that DSM time, the biggest factor to me is the fact that we had 2 subcategories. We yanked one away for 6 years, which took half of that population away, on top of the fact that we never even looked into adults. So there's a whole nother population that was never put into there. And then suddenly, after we took that away, suddenly we added a second and a third one back in, which opened it up to girls. We opened it up to adults because we knew it didn't go away. We realized that symptoms look differently across boys and girls. They look differently across life. And that opened up the scope of things. We don't have a cost-effective way to test genetically for ADHD. And so we are going to have to go to a psychotherapist. We're going to have to go to a doctor of some sort and get a diagnosis. And that diagnosis is largely based on the knowledge that person has about it, their opinion. There are some minute testings, but a lot of this is opinion based. And when it's opinion based, that can make it kind of hard to get the correct answer. It could be an answer we believe is right, but not necessarily the correct answer. While we would love to blame this on the vaccines and the pesticides and the food, all those things could be a portion of it. They could be affected. Everything that we are exposed to is going to affect our genes and how they look on some level if we are exposed to them for long periods, a lot of it over long periods of time. Right? So environmental factors can absolutely be a piece of this, but a lot of it is we didn't track it. And the way we've opened and closed the doors to symptoms and kind of willy-nilly recreated the DSM without maybe thinking ahead before making those changes. Because while we might have made those changes in hopes that it would be helpful and it would be some form of like utilitarianism where we would help out our people, it actually didn't help out the more people. We're getting better at that now. But on the back end, what it really did is it really changed the opinion of people about ADHD in a negative way. And now we have to show the facts to show that what a lot of them are saying isn't incorrect, but it's not the brunt of what happened. It's a small piece of that pie. Guys, I hope this helped clarify the whole, ADHD is a fad. Why are so many people getting, being diagnosed now? And one thing I didn't even cover is the fact that, when we talk about it more, I'm just going to, I guess we'll talk about it now. It's not all the way done yet. Throughout this time in the late 90s, the medical establishment was also able to directly advertise to consumers. And so suddenly we were seeing these commercials about pills that were like, ask your doctor, ask your doctor. They weren't all about like ADHD or anything like that. But when we start putting all of that together and then we add in the, hey, it's okay to ask your doctor, and hey, we're talking about ADHD more, all of this culturally is going to make it easier to get diagnosed because more people know about it. Not easier because it's just easier because, like I said, more doctors know about it. We know how to manage it. We know what it looks like across multiple different facets, across multiple places in life, and more people can be helped ultimately. Okay, now I'm done ranting. Again, I hope this helps out with figuring out, this might be the reason. I'm not saying it 100% is. I don't know that anybody really knows the reason, especially because we only have data from back in 97. If you go to the CDC website, and a lot of you guys are like, oh, CDC's BS, or cool, whatever. I don't know where you get your stuff from, but that's where we have a graph. But the fact that it starts like literally right when it goes up, it's like 97.5%, 98.6%, and it just kind of continuously goes up from there. The fact that we don't have anything before, it really just kind of takes away our ability to really look at this. But guys, if you have a reason why you think that it has gone up and you've done research, like I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Put it down in there, and let's chat about it. Other than that, y'all have an amazing day.